Today we're going to discuss polyhydramnios. This is a subject that I consider one of the most diverse and confusing of the entities that we must deal with in obstetrical sonography. As you know, variations in the quantity of amniotic fluid are not terribly uncommon, and this is certainly an entity that you will have to deal with several times during the course of a year. It's sufficiently confusing that the following is my favorite quote. Bevis was a physician who was one of the pioneers of amniocentesis, and he said this about the amniotic fluid. We know very little about the production and disposal of the liquor amnii. He was a Brit. The only sure fact is that in this country, nearly 2,000 tons go down the drain every year. Well, that might be a very clever statement, but in fact, quite a bit is actually known about amniotic fluid. I'm going to boil this down into its simplest components. Amniotic fluid behaves as a separate compartment within the pregnancy. The fetus will influence the amniotic fluid, and the mother will influence the amniotic fluid. But these are the facts that I try to keep in mind when I'm analyzing an aberration in amniotic fluid. After 16 weeks, virtually every drop of amniotic fluid comes from fetal urination. You should think of the fetal kidneys as the pre-processing plant for amniotic fluid. After it is produced, the amniotic fluid is swallowed by the fetus and then reabsorbed in the small bowel. So you can think of the small bowel as the post-processing unit. So anything that interferes with the production or absorption will alter the amniotic fluid volume. There will be times when polyhydramnios makes sense. So here we see a fetus with the double bubble sign. This happens to be the stomach. This happens to be the duodenum. I want to caution you that not all double bubbles are caused by a dilated duodenum and stomach. There are several other double bubbles that occur in the upper fetal abdomen. So be cautious that when you are about to say that this is secondary to a duodenal obstruction, that you actually document that the stomach communicates through the pyloric canal with the structure you are calling the dilated duodenum, or the second of the double bubbles. Note that when the duodenum is actually obstructed, the stomach is working against an obstruction, and therefore you will often see hypertrophy of the gastric wall as well. Here is a confusing origin of polyhydramnios. You might even think, well, here's a double bubble as well, but this particular double bubble is bilateral UPJ obstruction. So when we think about bilateral obstructions of the fetal urinary tract, we think about oligohydramnios, and yet bilateral UPJ obstruction is far more likely to be associated with polyhydramnios than it is with oligohydramnios. I spent about 2 decades thinking about why that should be so, and I have to tell you that I don't have a clue. I don't know why bilateral UPJ obstruction should cause polyhydramnios, but without question, it definitely does. So when we're thinking about polyhydramnios, we must have a very broad concept of what might be going on. I'll touch on this to a greater degree later in the lecture. So, there are abnormalities where it makes sense that the fetus should have polyhydramnios. So, a fetus with a central nervous system anomaly, that anomaly may interfere with the swallowing mechanism, resulting in inadequate swallowing and therefore inadequate reabsorption of fluid in the intestinal tract. Gastrointestinal tract obstructions, just as we discussed a moment ago, if the gastrointestinal tract is obstructed, then the likelihood that fluid will be normally reabsorbed in the small bowel greatly diminishes, and polyhydramnios likely will ensue. Certain varieties of neuromuscular disorders, these also can significantly interfere with swallowing, resulting in polyhydramnios. Then there are a variety of conditions that are known to be associated with increased perfusion through the fetus. The most important of these are the twin-to-twin transfusion syndrome and large teratomas. Under this circumstance, where increased perfusion results in polyhydramnios, we have increased perfusion throughout the fetus, which means we have increased blood flow to the kidneys. Increased blood flow to the kidneys results in increased urine output. Increased urine output can result in polyhydramnios.